Good morning, everyone. We are in Perek Beis, Mishna Hey, Chapter 2, Mishna 5 of Maseches Maasros. So we have mentioned already previously that according to Torah law, grain that enters into your house, produce that enters your house, is kaveh ala meiser. It sets the obligation of meiser upon this produce to the point you can't snack from it. The sages added other things that can actually bring that about. One of those things that we had mentioned before is selling it. If you sell that produce, even though it hasn't come into your house, nonetheless, that will now put upon this produce an obligation to the point that you cannot snack from it. And until now, we have been discussing the fact that if the case is that you're planning on taking your produce to the market to sell, that there the sages said that already once the processing in the field is completed, at that point already you can't snack. But now we're going to talk about other situations of selling where there will be discussion, especially in this Mishnah, as to whether in this case of selling you actually need the completion of the process or not. So Mishnah Hey reads, so one says to his friend, Heilach Isser Zeh, take this Isser. Isser was a type of a coin in the times of the Mishnah. And give me 5 figs for it. The case here is that you are a person who has an orchard. He's got figs growing on a tree, and you want to purchase those figs. Now, the case here is that these figs are still attached to the tree. And now the question is, now that you want to buy them from the person, he's selling them to you, what is going to be the law about separating Trumas and Maasros before you want to eat from it? So the Mishnah says, Lo yoichal achia aser divri Rabbi Meir. One may not eat from these figs until he actually ties it, until he actually separates Trumas and Maasros from it. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that clearly these figs are not processed. They're coming straight off the tree. As we learned previously, figs become completely processed after you pick them. And if you're not planning on drying them, you put them in a basket, you cover them with leaves. That hasn't happened here, clearly. And therefore, Rabbi Meir says that if you want to snack from those figs, you can do so. You cannot do so. Lo yoichal Meir says you cannot eat them until you meiser them, that even though you have not processed them, nonetheless, since they're being sold, that is kaveh ala meiser. That will now set meiser, the obligation of meiser, onto these figs to the point that you cannot snack from them. So that's Rabbi Meir. You cannot eat until you meiser. And even though the processing hasn't been completed, nonetheless, the selling will make it that you cannot snack from it. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eichal achas potter. If you eat one at a time, you're exempt. The Mitzayrav chayev. But if they were combined, then you're going to be obligated to separate. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is, Eichal achas means, if you eat one at a time, that means the seller picks up a fig, gives it to you, and you eat. If the eating is done one at a time, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can do that. As long as you're snacking, you're not eating it like a meal, you're snacking from it, it's going to be okay. The processing hasn't been completed, and therefore just the fact that it's being sold isn't going to be enough to set the obligation of meiser to the point that you can't snack from it. However, he says, but if they were combined together, then they're liable. That means that if the seller, instead of handing you one at a time, he took 2 at a time. He picked 2 at a time, he held 2 at a time in his hand, then he gave them to you. Then already you cannot snack from them. At this point, they are kaveh ala meiser. The meiser obligation is set that you cannot snack from it. Why? I mean, it's clear that Yehuda's opinion is that if the figs aren't processed yet, that selling it isn't kaveh ala meiser. So what's happening now? So the explanation is that the Rabbanan, the sages, made a stringency that if the seller takes 2 figs at a time, he's made a mini pile, a very small pile. And at that point, the sages decided to be strict and say this is processed enough that selling will now be kaveh l'maisa to the point you can't snack. We know clearly that when you're dealing with fresh figs, a pile or whatever, it goes into a basket. The basket is covered with leaves. That's the completion of the processing. Here, the Rabbanan made a stringency to say that making even a small pile is processed enough that we should say that now that you're also selling it, now the obligation of Meiser is set to this produce. You cannot snack from it. So therefore, if he hands you one at a time, it's not a pile, it's not processed. The fact that it's being sold isn't going to forbid you from snacking. However, if there was already two put together, that means it was a very small pile. It's considered enough to be a pile. Two already is a pile. That is enough of a processing that we say that now the sale will be kaveh l'maiser, will set meiser to the point you can't snack from it. The Bartanura brings down from the Talmud Yerushalmi, from the Jerusalem Talmud, that this whole machlekes Reb Meir, meaning according to Reb Meir, if he hands you one at a time, it's not going to make a difference. If he's selling it to you, that's kaveh l'maiser. According to Yehuda, one at a time is not going to be selling in one at a time. The selling won't be kaveh l'maiser. In the case that we're talking about, the machlekes that Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda have about whether you can eat one at a time or not, is talking about where it is the seller who now gave you one at a time. According to Reb Meir, when the seller gave you one at a time, that's that sale, the sale that's taking place with the seller giving you those figs, that is going to be kaveh l'maiser. You cannot snack from it anymore. But if, let's say, the case was that the seller didn't pick off the figs, you did it. You're the buyer. He gave you permission to walk over to the tree and pick the figs, and you picked one at a time. And as you picked one at a time, you ate them. B, in the case where it's the buyer who's picking and he's doing it one at a time, there Reb Meir would agree that it's not kaveh l'maiser. You can snack from it. It's only when it's the seller who's giving it to you, even one at a time, that Reb Meir says the sale sets the meiser obligation. You cannot snack from it anymore. Even in the case where it's the buyer who is picking the figs, it's only going to help one at a time, according to everyone, to say, according to all opinions, they can eat from it. Were he to take two at a time and create this mini pile, then again, everybody would agree that in that situation, he cannot snack from it anymore, because that level of processing plus the sale will now forbid you from snacking on it. Rabbi Yehuda said, he brought a proof to his opinion. There was a rose garden in Yerushalayim where not only were roses growing there, but also figs. And they sold there the figs for 3 or 4 figs to an isser. Again, isser is a coin. And basically, you could say for a fact, in this case, there was no truma meiser ever separated. Meaning, this is meaning like this, as the commentaries explain. The case here is that this was, again, a combination of a rose garden and a fig tree being sold there, the figs being sold there. So the case was, as we established before, in order for Yehuda to prove his opinion, we're talking about that it is the seller who was giving these figs to the buyer, and they were being done one at a time. That we know they're being done one at a time. And because they're being done one at a time, so according to Reb Meir, one at a time doesn't help. The sale should be kaveh l'maiser. At the end of the day, what happened here, Rabbi Yehuda says that we know by this rose garden where they were selling the figs, that when they were being given one at a time, that there was no truma or meiser being separated ever in that kind of situation. Apparently, that was a very common way how it was done there. And it was known that no trumas and meisers were ever separated under those circumstances, which is probably the way that it was done there. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, you see, like what I say, that even that when it's one at a time, the fact that there's a sale taking place isn't going to be kaveh l'maiser to the point you can't snack. Now, what still has to be pointed out is, and the Bartanur points this out, is that, well, maybe what happened there was, as we made a distinction before, If it's the seller who's giving it to you one at a time, that's what the mayor says, that you can't eat it, you can't snack on it. But if it was the buyer who was picking the figs one at a time, Rameir would agree that you can snack on it. So maybe in this case, by the rose garden, where the Truma Navaisa was never taken, it's because it was the buyers that were picking the figs one at a time and eating them. Says the Bartanura, it can't be, because this was a rose garden too. And the owner of this garden didn't want people walking into his garden because they may ruin the roses. So there was no one coming into this garden to pick the figs. It had to be the seller that was giving those figs. And he was giving it one at a time. And no Truma or Meiser was ever separated. Says Rabbi Yehuda, you see, like my opinion, that in the situation where, although a sale is taking place, even if it's the seller that's giving the figs and they're being given and eaten one at a time, there is no problem snacking from them. And continuing with the Chavetz Chaim's discussion of the potential sins that one can transgress while when speaking Lashon Harah. There are times where the person speaking Lashon Harah may be transgressing the prohibition of do not hate your friend in your heart. Going for instance, in b'fanav shel midaber es re'eyu. In front of the person, you speak like you're his friend. B'shaloi b'fanav, but behind his back, mavish esreich b'fnei acherim. That's when he puts him down. He puts him down for the things that he's done wrong. My understanding here is that he's putting him down for the things that he did wrong to him. But perhaps it's not only talking about that. It could be talking about just putting him down. Now, so what's happening here is that you are hiding your hatred from this person from the person. He doesn't know that you're doing this to him. He doesn't know that he can protect himself from you. You're putting him down, but you show him in front of him. You know, when you interact with him, you act like a friend. So he has no idea what you're doing to him, but behind his back, you're putting him down. So you're hiding the hatred from him, and he's not aware of it. He's not aware how to protect himself from it. Therefore, the person who's doing that, who's again in front of the person speaking like a friend, behind his back speaking Lashon Harah, putting him down, that would be considered transgressing the prohibition of do not hate your friend in your heart, keeping the hatred inside. And all the more so if he explicitly tells the people who are listening to his Lashon Harah, that they should not tell him what he's saying about him. Reuben is telling the listeners, do not tell Shimon what I'm telling about him. In that situation, you for sure transgressing his prohibition. If you're basically concealing the hatred from him, and not just concealing, in a sense, passively, you're telling them, do not let him know, then for sure, he says, in that situation, it is clear that you're transgressing his prohibition, because by saying explicitly to them, don't let him know what I'm saying, that's clear how you are covering up your hatred from him. And therefore, if it comes out that the Lashon Harah you're speaking is being spoken in a way that he thinks you're his best friend, and you're putting him down behind his back, so he's not aware of your hatred, he's not aware of your hatred, you're concealing the hatred from him, and all the more so if you're explicitly concealing the hatred from him, that is a situation where you'd be transgressing this prohibition of do not hate your friend in your heart. Next is actually two prohibitions. There are times where a person speaking Lashon Harah will also transgress the prohibitions of do not take revenge or do not bear a grudge. For instance, you have a hatred towards this person. You ask someone to do you a favor. You wanted to borrow money. You asked him for a favor. The person refused. And he did not help you. Because of that, you bear a grudge, you bear hatred in your heart for him. And if afterwards you see him do something wrong, you publicize it in front of people. That's how you're taking revenge. You're taking revenge because of the fact that since he didn't do you a favor, now you're going to get back at him by putting him down. By bearing the hatred in his heart, he is now transgressing the prohibition of do not loisita, which means don't bear a grudge. But then later when he takes revenge, the sipur alav avarizeh hadivrei gnush alav, and because of the fact that he didn't help you, you get back at him by putting him down. That is when you transgress the prohibition of don't take revenge. You have to erase it from your heart. You got to get rid of it as best as you can from your heart, not to bear the grudge, and then not to follow, and not to take revenge. Have a wonderful day.